Robert Palmer's excellent talk, and I would like to acknowledge at the outset my great indebtedness to him. I'd like to open my lecture, as I do my book, with an excerpt from an early 14th century poem, The Outlaw's Song of Trail Bastion. You who are indicted, I counsel you, come to me, to the green forest of Belregard, where there is no lawsuit, nothing but the savage beast and the pleasant shade, for too uncertain is the common law. For one accused of felony in medieval England, like this poem's outlaw, the common law was indeed uncertain or doubtful. If a trial followed, a defendant's fate, a walk to the gallows or a walk home, rested in the hands of 12 local men sworn to speak the truth, verum dicere, to give a verdict about the alleged crime. A walk to the gallows or a walk home. Now, had anyone examined the parchment plea rolls of the king's courts and tabulated verdicts, they might have reassured our outlaw that his chances were actually quite good. Most medieval English juries acquitted, and many other defendants secured pardons. Admittedly, this would have been small comfort to the outlaw who had witnessed a gallows scene in his lifetime, or who had known a family bereft of their worldly possessions after a parent's felonious error led to forfeiture of their worldly goods. The one who can save me is the Son of Mary, reflected our poetic outlaw. For I was not culpable, but was indicted through envy. He who put me in this place, may God curse him. The world is so changeable, he who trusts in it is a fool. Though tempted to tarry in the shady woods of Belregard, let me cut to the chase. The central claim of my book is that the medieval English system of felony adjudication had at its core an understanding of culpability situated in the heart and mind, as opposed to merely the hands of the person who committed an allegedly criminal act. Mens rea, or guilty mind, constituted the foundation of medieval English criminal liability. And this was true despite the fact that trials were perfunctory, with few procedural protections for defendants, and despite the fact that there was no statutory criminal law to speak of. Now, of course, other factors mattered too. Repeat actors came in for greater condemnation, as did people known locally to be of dubious reputation or character. Yet even these factors, viewed from the perspective of measuring culpability, tend to circle back to the issue of heart and mind. Nothing speaks better to a person's ill intent than repeated recourse to criminal acts. And a person's acts, ambiguous in isolation, can appear to be permeated by wickedness when viewed in the light of known bad character. To say that juries considered reputation and character, therefore, does not negate the principle that what most interested them was the question of the intentionality brought to bear upon an allegedly criminal act. So why did mind matter? Mind, inseparable from heart in the medieval Western European worldview, mattered because the culture of the period, the 13th into the 14th century, was steeped in an understanding of guilt based on intentionality, on a person's interior orientation toward the actions he or she undertook in the world. Medieval English felony law took root during an age of penitential literature, which encouraged deep reflection on the nature of sin. In England, of course, jury trial for felony arose after 1215 due to the Fourth Lateran Council of the Catholic Church, which effectively abolished trial by ordeal by forbidding priests from participating in the procedure. The Fourth Lateran Council also mandated that all Christians make confession annually to their parish priests. So jury trial for felony took root during this time of penitential literature, which encouraged deep reflection on the nature of sin. I think I just repeated myself. So this was a time of heightened attention to the importance of confession and examination of conscience, both by penitents and confessors. The centrality of mind to weighing guilt arises in the theological texts that informed the sermons jurors heard at church and the advice they received during confession. This theme appears repeatedly in a diverse range of registers and in Middle English, Latin, and Anglo-Norman French texts alike. Now, why might my book draw upon the writings of Thomas of Chobham and Geoffrey Chaucer, upon theology and literature in thinking about medieval English law? In general, I contend that peering beyond the legal record enables the legal historian to hypothesize about many of the mysteries yet unsolved behind the early common law system of felony adjudication, particularly the black box of jury verdicts and how juries understood what they were doing in sorting the guilty from the innocent. So I can't, in a single lecture, cover the topical range of the book, which covers questions of etymology, including the meaning of the word felony in Middle English, Anglo-Norman French, and Latin. I'll not go into great detail on etymology today, aside from pointing out that the Latin felonia is likely derived from the classical Latin fel, or gallbladder, which figuratively referred to animosity or bitterness. My book also looks to non-legal texts to understand how jurors understood the meaning of the word felony. In both Middle English and Anglo-Norman French, felony connoted villainy, wickedness, or deceit. For example, words of felony were used in literary texts to describe wicked characters, like Judas, who betrayed Christ, or Herod, who was implicated in the slaughter of the innocents. My book also explores medieval English understandings of anger. In modern criminal law, a killing undertaken in anger is sometimes treated as manslaughter rather than murder, particularly if the killing was in some way provoked. In medieval England, anger could be an aggravating or a mitigating factor, depending on the circumstances. On the one hand, anger was seen to be a product of an ill-formed conscience. This pushed in the direction of finding moral blameworthiness when a person acted out of anger. On the other hand, anger in its more extreme manifestations was seen to inhibit a person's ability to reason and to inspire behavior resembling insanity, thereby possibly pointing toward a partial excuse. My book also studies literary tales of judges good and bad to understand the perils involved in the act of judging, perils shared by justices and jurors in the English system of felony adjudication after 1215. And the book posits that just as a defendant's guilt or innocence turned on the state of her heart and mind, so too did the interior disposition of justices and jurors determine whether the act of judging brought them a step closer to heaven or to hell. Judges and jurors were to exercise mercy, avoid anger, and approach judging with humility and self-reflection, bearing in mind that one who is a sinner today might be a saint tomorrow. So of course, I can't cover all these themes today, but I will try to share with you some of the key findings of my book. And I want to state at the outset that I take it as a given that some understanding of mind influenced jury verdicts. As Oliver Wendell Holmes famously quipped, even a dog knows the difference between being kicked and being stumbled over. What my book does is pose a question that has not yet been tackled by English legal historians. How did medieval English jurors think about guilty mind? It's a question fundamental to the Anglo-American system of criminal law, as it gets to the heart of how we continue to think about criminal responsibility in the 21st century. Juries had tremendous discretion, So the question, to my mind, is extremely important. So why has no one asked this question before? In part, it's an exceedingly difficult question to answer, particularly by legal historians committed to working within the four corners of the legal record. For me, it has required familiarizing myself with texts that, as a legal historian, I would not have expected to rely so heavily upon. Sermons, poems, manuals for parish priests, to take a few examples. Legal records, after all, were not designed to tell us what jurors were thinking and how they reached their verdicts. Now, it must be acknowledged that the vast majority of jurors were illiterate, in the sense that they could neither read nor write. Most of them spoke no language other than English, while the written material from this period is largely, but not exclusively, in Latin and French. Nevertheless, whether one looks at elite theological texts like the writings of Thomas of Chobham, or humble vernacular texts written for barely literate parish priests, one finds remarkable consistency in the treatment of felony and discussion of issues of mind. Medieval England had a largely oral culture, and these ideas reached the ears of jurors, whether through sermons, conversations during confession, or stories shared by the hearthside, or while passing time during the workday. Coupled with this is the remarkable development of what has aptly been termed vernacular theology, by means of which cutting-edge theological ideas reached a broad English audience through the 14th and into the early 15th century. Now, in some instances, medieval writers expounded quite self-consciously upon their use of the vernacular to reach a wider audience. The author of the Preek of Conscience, a Middle English poem written in the first half of the 14th century and surviving in a remarkably large number of manuscripts, used a lovely metaphor of exhalation to describe the act of vernacular authorship. So the Preek of Conscience says, therefore is this book breathed out from various matters that are unknown to men lewd and unknowing who cannot understand Latin, himself to bring to know within and to withdraw himself from sin. And I love that image of the book being breathed out into the vernacular. And of course, material evidence provides further clues regarding ideas and circulation among those who participated in Sunday liturgies. Among the relatively few Old Testament scenes frequently found in English church frescoes was the image of the murder of Abel by his brother Cain, who killed out of jealousy and later experienced a violent death himself. Nevertheless, as someone who has occasionally nodded off in church, I acknowledge that it would be unwise to assume that all these texts found a willing and attentive audience. William Langland's personification of sloth may capture at least a subset of the men from whom medieval English juries were drawn. So Sloth tells us, I cannot say, and I guess my Middle English text is coming through a little funny looking here, but I cannot say my Pater Noster perfectly as the priest sings it, but I know rhymes of Robin Hood and Randolph, Earl of Chester, but neither of our Lord nor our Lady the least that was ever made. I've made 40 vows and forgotten them by the morning. I never performed the penance as the priest enjoined me, nor really sorry for my sins, yet was I never. And if I bid any beads, but do so in wrath, what I tell with my tongue is 2 miles from my heart. Yet even Sloth, in his painful honesty, tells us something about societal expectations in late 14th century England. In general, peering beyond the legal record enables us, again, to think about these mysteries. Why was there such a high acquittal rate? Why was there such heavy reliance upon escape valves like abjuration and benefit of clergy? And maybe we could ask, why was there a lack of statutory development on the criminal side? So legal historians have much to learn from literature, but what can we glean from the legal record itself? And that's where I'll focus much of the remainder of my talk. What I'd like to do is to walk you through the legal record, and I know there are many medievalists in the audience for whom this will be very rudimentary and familiar, um, but I'll walk you through the legal record and explain why I have found it necessary to venture a bit further afield to those religious and literary texts to flesh out an understanding of guilty mind. So what do I mean when I talk about the legal record in 13th and 14th century England? In cases of homicide, the legal record includes coroner's rolls, which provide an initial narrative of an alleged homicide. This narrative was produced by an inquest jury, which examined the body with the coroner and tried to piece together the facts surrounding the death. Now, these records tend to survive in relatively poor condition and in smaller numbers, much smaller numbers than the corresponding plea rolls. And as one knows, if you've looked at the remarkable work of my dissertation advisor, Tom Green, it's remarkably challenging to match up coroner's records with trial records, although he managed to do that for quite a number of cases. The legal record also includes plea rolls, or records of trial that occurred often at jail delivery sessions when a jail was emptied of all its prisoners, or at an air, a judicial visitation involving royal justices riding circuit and hearing civil and criminal pleas. And here, for those of you who don't work with medieval records, I don't know how well you can see on this image, but the little sort of paragraph symbols which indicate the start of each new case record. Now, finally, some would include treatises and also perhaps yearbooks or law reports within the category of legal record, although they are not formal court records. Nevertheless, these are sources that I rely upon as well in fleshing out a picture of what was going on. I'll also provide just a very quick summary of procedure for those who are not medievalists. There was no trial in the modern sense of that term. The indictment, if a case was brought by indictment, would have been read to the defendant, who typically pleaded not guilty and put himself on the jury. The defendant had no legal counsel. The jury produced a verdict. In the vast majority of cases, they acquitted outright. In a very large number of cases, they found that a defendant had killed accidentally or in self-defense, and a pardon ensued. In a small minority of cases, they convicted the defendant, who was then hanged. Judging from the records, trials appear to have been high-volume, quick affairs. We can look back again at the jail delivery roll I showed you a moment ago, and you can get a sense of what was likely a relatively fast-paced rhythm of court proceedings, although we know that what happened in the courtroom was boiled down to the essential matters that record keeping was designed for. But you can get a sense of the rhythm of court proceedings, of the repeated acquittals, and the punctuation of the occasional conviction and hanging. So how is felony understood within legal records? Because many cases end in a bald acquittal or conviction, meaning the trial record says very little, I take the via negativa in my book, discerning the meaning of felony in part by focusing on what jurors found not to be felonious. Therefore, I focus in many instances on cases involving child defendants, women under duress, the mentally ill, self-defenders, the kinds of cases in which a jury provides a little more narrative to explain why they felt that the defendant's purported crime did not amount to felony. And I argue ultimately that the paradigm of felony was a crime involving rational deliberation, the exercise of a person's will in the absence of a countervailing necessity, and a blameworthy or perhaps even wicked disposition. I'll begin with a homicide case from 1249. So William Skye stood accused of the death of Robert Batting. Robert had been climbing a hayrick, and he allegedly tumbled off the hayrick and landed on top of William. Startled by the impact, William struck Robert twice on the head, killing him. Now, one might speculate as to the factors the jury might have weighed in reaching a verdict. For example, they might have wondered whether William bore any prior grudge against Robert. They might ask, how quickly did he respond? Was it in the heat of the moment? Or did he fumble around for his staff before striking Robert? Did William intend to kill or to seriously injure Robert? And a question that still perplexes me, would the fall from the hayrick itself have killed Robert even if William had not struck him? And here I've puzzled over this a little bit. I've concluded I don't think a fall from a 21st century hayrick would likely be fatal. But it's remarkable looking at some visual evidence from closer to the time period, although I'm sure this is imaginative in the ways that Hieronymus Bosch tends to be imaginative. You see a very tremendous hayrick in his Haywain triptych. And if we zoom in, if you look at that space between the two wagon wheels, we can see that things can get quite ugly beneath a hayrick. Now, of course, I'm playing with my imagination. We'll never know whether the jurors asked or answered any of those particular questions. We'll also never know how big exactly a medieval hayrick was, although there probably is, I'm sure, visual evidence in some manuscripts. What we do know is that the jury, in what may strike us as an apparent contradiction, decided that William was guilty of Robert's death, culpabilis de dicta morte, but that he did not commit the homicide through felony. Rather, he did so through simplicity due to his tender age. William, as it turns out, was 12 years old. He secured a pardon. So examining cases like this one, the legal historian can begin to see what was not felony according to medieval English jurors. In the case of young William, we have a reflexive, unpremeditated act, as well as the excuse of simplicity. Now, of course, insanity might also negate a felony charge due to lack of deliberation. In a mid-14th century case, John, son of William, was indicted for arson. He allegedly burned down another man's house. A local jury determined that John was a lunatic who was vexed by the sickness of dementia 3 or 4 times a year, and that he was acutely afflicted by that illness for 8 days before and after the alleged arson, having no awareness or discretion of good or evil or of his own deeds. He was acquitted. So usually these cases end in pardon, but in this instance, he was acquitted. To take a second example, in an early 14th century case from Norwich, Philip Stateman faced trial for killing his wife. He pleaded not guilty. The jury, in turn, stated under oath that although Philip did kill Agnes, at the time that he did so, and for a long time before and after, he was detained continually due to his frenzy. Moreover, prior to the homicide, he had committed many and diverse infamies by night and by day, and he was mad at the time he committed the homicide. In light of the jury's testimony, Philip was remanded to prison to await a pardon. So I have a third example, because I just love these insanity cases, but I won't go into depth on this particular one. Aside from pointing out some of the language that I've highlighted here, Robert is described as having been a lunatic for 14 years and having killed Simon, who was his servant, while suffering that illness and in frenzy, not in felony or malice aforethought. And what we see in the margination of the record is the fact that Robert received a pardon, and we see that the king was moved by pity in pardoning Robert. So medieval records like this demonstrate an understanding of mental illness as both durational and episodic in intensity. For example, as we see in the case of Robert, we're told that he was sick for 14 years and was in the throes of that illness when he committed the alleged crime. Now, felony is also used in opposition to misadventure or accidental deaths. A 14th century Northamptonshire case, for example, described how William Wodreve casting the penny stone with other men, and I gather that this involved throwing a stone, maybe the medieval form of bocce, that he inadvertently, when casting the penny stone, killed a 7-year-old boy named Walter, who had suddenly crossed the line of the goals. According to the jury, William had indeed killed the child, but not out of any will to harm him. And here the official heir record illuminates courtroom procedure ever so slightly, noting that the jurors first provided a basic narrative of the game and its unfortunate outcome, and saying that, yes, William did kill the child. So to put it in modern legal terms, the jurors first described the actus reus. And they were then pressed further, presumably by the justices, to indicate whether or not William had killed Walter by felony or by any other malice aforethought. The jurors, exceeding the parameters of the question, responded that William's action was done, quote, not out of felony or any other malice aforethought, nor from any desire or will to harm the child, but was instead purely accidental, and William secured a pardon. So misadventure or accident was defined in contrast with felony, which was in turn paired by the justices and jurors alike with notions of malice aforethought and intent to harm. To move on to another facet of the word, felony seems to have demanded the absence of necessity and the unimpeded exercise of an individual's volitional faculty or will. So, for example, a married woman might be excused of felony if she had been acting under the command of her husband. In a 1249 Wiltshire case, Robert Laffoleur and his wife Agnes were found to have harbored a thief and known outlaw. While Robert was hanged for the deed, the jury acquitted Agnes, indicating that she was so subjected to her husband that she had to obey. Now, the most frequently discussed example of necessity in the plea rules is self-defense. In one of the 13th century treatise's more poetic passages, Bracton describes self-defense as an unavoidable necessity committed without premeditated hatred, but with sorrow of heart. This idea of sorrow of heart appears frequently in contemporary literature, where it connotes the appropriate demeanor for one seeking absolution for sin. In Handling Sin, from 1303, for example, Robert Manning described the appropriate comportment of a penitent person. If thou wilt have the sacrament, he wrote, it behooves thee to give well better intent and record every deed with sorrow of heart and with dread, and forethink with much moan that thou may not think of each one. So self-defense cases also relate to another aspect of felony, namely wickedness. Now, here we take a step away from what seem to be more neutral legal categories and concepts, premeditation, necessity, insanity, and move into the murky area of morality. In many self-defense cases, mens rea appears to be a required element, but more so in terms of the deceased's wicked state of mind rather than the defendant's. Frequently, the jury portrays the defendant as innocent and the deceased individual as both the initial aggressor and the actual felon. In a 1313 Bedfordshire jail delivery case, William Mose of Woodhull stood accused of the felonious killing of William Bass. According to the jury's narrative, which I'm directly translating and paraphrasing here, while Mose slept in his home one night, Bass entered his yard and hid with malice aforethought, planning to kill Mose. Ignorant of the plot, Mose arose at dawn and stepped outside his home, thinking evil toward no one. In the meantime, Bass feloniously jumped out at Mose with malice aforethought and assaulted him with a staff, intending to kill him. Furthermore, when Mose tried to flee, Bass pursued him feloniously and vigorously, and with felony aforethought. Having no alternative, Mose struck Bass with a knife, inflicting a fatal wound. So where the jurors repeatedly ascribed to Bass felonious and malicious thoughts, they concluded that Mose did not kill Bass by any felony or malice of forethought, but only in self-defense, and that he could not have evaded his own death in any other way. Mose was ultimately recommended for a pardon. So in this light, self-defense takes on the glow of a regrettable, but nevertheless justifiable execution of a felon. Needless to say, we are not in a world of stand your ground, but rather in a world of retreat, where a person only employs deadly force where there's no other alternative, and does so indeed with sorrow of heart. Many self-defense narratives emphasize the deceased's wicked state of mind and the self-defender's lack of alternatives. So to take one other example very briefly, this is a 1310 homicide case in which Robert, son of John, was accused of slaying William, son of Henry Bishop. And the jurors here used strong adverbs to paint the deceased man's aggression against Robert and his father John in the utmost negative light. We learn that the incident began in an argument over the raising of a dike, and the dispute quickly escalated into physical violence. And the trial record tells us how William assaulted John and struck him gravely with a spade, and how William then approached Robert, the son, and struck him ferociously as well. So we see these hyperbolic adverbs which leave little doubt in the narrative that culpability resided with the deceased rather than with Robert, a clear self-defender who in this instance had also acted in defense of kin. And Robert was to receive a royal pardon as well. So drawing upon cases like these, my book concludes that felony, when used in legal records, denoted a crime involving the presence of deliberation and forethought, the exercise of reason and free will, and the absence of necessity or chance. Moreover, even when employed in legal records, felony often conjured up an image of moral blameworthiness, sometimes rising to the level of wickedness and depravity. Now, these connotations of felony can also be found across the Channel in Normandy, as evidenced by the French translation of the earlier Latin version of the Customs of Normandy. The section on homicide uses the French felony as a direct translation for the Latin inique, which can mean unjustly or wrongfully, but also wickedly or sinfully. In other contexts, such as the Psalm translations of the 14th century English scholar and hermit Richard Rulla, felony is used as a direct translation for the Latin nequitia, meaning wickedness or evil. Now, this last dimension of felony, wickedness, would have been familiar to jurors from sermons and literature alike. In a Middle English apocryphal account of Jesus's childhood, we find a story that loosely parallels contemporary self-defense narratives insofar as it places blame upon the individuals who end up dead, while justifying the actions of the homicidal actor, in this instance, the young boy, Jesus. So as the story relates, one afternoon, Jesus called out to his playmates, asking if they would go leap with him upon the hills. Now, it's unclear just how popular Jesus was in his Nazareth neighborhood, but the story suggests that not all the local kids were fans of the Wunderkind. In fact, some of the children, the text tells us, thought of him enviously, with heart as bitter as gall. Gall, again, being the Middle English equivalent of the Latin fell. Trying to rival Jesus in leaping, these overly ambitious and fell-hearted children broke their necks and died. And the image here shows Jesus kind of dukes up, challenging the last child to jump, while three unfortunate playmates lie dead in the valley below. And of course, upon Joseph fell the undesirable duty of informing the fathers that their children were, quote, dead as a stone. The fathers lamented and accused Jesus of wrongfully killing the children, saying Jesus had slain through felony. And I'll just acknowledge here that there is anti-Semitic imagery in this manuscript image and in the text of this piece. But I use it to kind of get at the understanding of what felony meant in the period. So the fathers, say that Jesus had slain through felony. Mary begged her son to restore the children to life, and Jesus dutifully complied. And what you see in this particular image is, on the one hand, Joseph smoothing things over with the fathers, and Jesus on the right-hand side of the image, appropriately smaller in size as a child, raising his playmates from the dead. In the end, the newly resurrected children warned others not to, don't mess with Jesus, they essentially said. Quote, for if you do, he will kill you. And it's a wonderful use. The verb used there is spilin, which is very close to spillin, or it's spillin, very close to spilin, which means to play. So they're a play on words with killing and playing. So if you mess with Jesus, he may kill you. Jesus here is credited by the narrator with restoring the children to life. But the children themselves suggest that Jesus had also been instrumental in bringing about their deaths in the first place. As in a case of rightful self-defense, the audience may be reassured of Jesus's ultimate innocence by recalling that it was the children and not Jesus who had been cast as the fell-hearted characters in the story. Now, as amusing as this tale may be to our ears, at least some aspects of it, and most assuredly it held some humor for its contemporary audience as well, I find that it speaks to the quotidian manner in which words of felony might be employed in literature. And it also speaks to a theme commonly found in contemporary medieval English literature, namely an overwhelming concern with the misjudging of Jesus as a felon. And I'd like to suggest that these literary and homiletical themes relate directly to the remarkably high felony acquittal rate in medieval England. English jurors would have been familiar with this literary trope of the misjudgment of Christ, which served as a reminder of the dangers involved in judging and as a spur to the exercise of mercy, particularly when one was in danger of sending an innocent man to the gallows. So in closing, I'll note that another common trope in literary and homiletical sources is the use of the language of judgment and felony to emphasize the shared criminality or sinfulness of all. Who may say, I am clean from sin? Asked one sermon author. Chaucer's parson would opine that Jesus was wounded for our misdeeds and defouled by our felonies. So just as the thought of condemning an innocent man to death might give a juror pause, so too might this image of the common felonious nature, most certainly in thought and in some instances in deed, of all men and women. Although much of this lecture has been devoted to pointing out the nuances and complexity of felony as a point of law, I close on a very different image, that of the commonplace nature of felony. As the same sermon author would remind his audience, spiritually, we are all felons, all pilgrims. Perhaps these seemingly contradictory perspectives on felony as the domain of wicked literary villains, but also felony as a shared and universal human trait, helps to explain the abundance of pardons and acquittals from jurors faced with a law that prescribed the gallows for all convicted of felony. So thank you, and I'm going to stop my share so I can see all of you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kamali. That was absolutely fantastic, fascinating, a lot to think about here. I will go ahead and open it up for questions if anybody would like to ask any. Please just raise your virtual hand or just chime in. while people are thinking, I will ask one myself if you don't mind. I'm very curious about the influence of religious belief on the actions of jurors in this regard. You're speaking to sermons kind of providing an influence on how they might have perceived their role as jurors. Could you speak perhaps to the interplay between the kind of religious impetus towards forgiveness and the need to be impartial as a judge, considering what it was they were doing in their work as jurors?
Right. So that tension between mercy and impartiality. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a conflict for jurors. It's also a conflict for judges who are involved in all of this, and it's a little bit of a mystery what the interactions are between those judges and jurors. I mean, the way I see it, so there is tension between forgiveness or mercy and impartiality. I would almost put the tension as between forgiveness or mercy and, really wanting to deal with some troublesome crime. So that's sort of another balancing point. And I do think that kind of helps to explain why when we do find convictions, very often it is in instances where someone is described as a notorious thief, for instance, where you get a sense of somebody who is a repeat offender. And less often, are we seeing convictions in instances where, it might have been a first offense, where we, get some sense that in some instances, for instance, juries are valuing goods less than they were actually worth, and so forth. Trying to find ways, sometimes just acquitting outright, but trying to find ways in which to exercise mercy towards the defendants that come before them. And I'm not sure, like, impartiality, I guess, that seems to me like a really modern way of thinking about the issue. There is that notion, in the literature about judges, that they shouldn't be swayed by gifts and favors and that sort of thing. So in that sense, we do have a sense of a judge needs to be impartial, but I don't think it's to the same degree as we think of impartiality as so central to the act of judging. But rather, I think what would have really troubled jurors is how to balance the, sentiments you might have that would compel you not to send someone to the gallows against the dangers that someone might be posing in a local community.
Sure. Well, thank you. Do we have any additional questions? I think everyone's just mulling it over. That was absolutely fascinating. Oh, Philippa, sorry if I'm mispronouncing names. I do apologize.
Don't worry, that's fine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. This is really, really fascinating. I've been working on some similar themes in the early modern period, and I'm just really curious to see what kinds of continuities there are. I was wondering how far you see phrases like per instigazione diaboli, like by the instigation of the devil, and how far that's seen to either mitigate or worsen the case for acquittal or pardoning, because I have seen it in all kinds of contexts, but it's not always clear to me that, in some ways it would seem to us that the invasion and kind of intrusion of the devil into the heart and the mind would have that mitigating effect, in that it's not fully on the individual. But then would the devil be tempting you if you were not in some way already culpable? It is something I'm not clear on, and I was wondering if you've observed any pattern looking at murders in particular or suicides.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's actually quite striking about the legal records is I don't find references to that idea of a person being instigated by the devil. And that does stand in dramatic contrast with what one finds in literary texts from the time, when very often that is a theme of somebody being instigated or tempted by the devil. And so I'm not sure exactly how to explain that disconnect.
So you don't find that in the legal records at all, that phrase?
I don't, I mean, it's very, very rare.
Okay.
It's sometimes in cases of insanity, but extremely rarely. Sarah Butler has written about this as well in her work on the insanity defense. where, you know, she points out that it's generally insanity is described as an illness, and you don't really find references to the workings of the devil, or if you do, it's in extremely rare circumstances. So I have a sense that this is something that develops probably somewhere beyond the 14th century, but is something kind of puzzling given the frequency with which it does appear in literary texts. So I would love to hear more about what you find in those later records.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Catherine?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thanks very much, Liz. Really interesting, and even for me as a non-medievalist, lots of food for thought. I'm not an expert on the medieval period, so I have one brief question just for info, and then my proper question. So my question for info is, did the jury actually hear witnesses, or were they entirely self-informing? And then my question is really to do with the insanity plea, but especially the notion of dangerousness. I remember Naomi Hernard 50 years ago said something about if a pardon was not issued for an insane person, it was because the family simply did not want to have to deal with them. So my question is that in some way related to a notion of dangerousness, that the community decides that a person who is mentally ill is simply too dangerous to be allowed to live, and so they find them guilty? Because otherwise I don't understand why they wouldn't simply say that they're not guilty, because they're not fully culpable for their actions.
Yeah, so excellent question. So I'll start with the insanity issue. So, you know, I don't find examples where someone is described in the plea rolls as insane, but is then not either acquitted or pardoned. You know, that doesn't mean it wasn't happening, that some people were convicted. What I do see in some of the cases that end in pardon is the testimony suggests that the person has a history of dangerousness. You know, sometimes it'll mention that a person had been violent towards themselves or towards others. Sometimes you'll get a sense that the neighbors have had to keep an eye, and this was just a day on which something lapsed in the plans for, you know, kind of safekeeping, that they ended up killing someone, for example. So certainly you see that sense of the fact that some persons acting in a state of insanity could have a history of dangerousness, but I don't see that translating into a conviction. Maybe that is happening. So that's an example where being able to match up a coroner's record, you know, if you get an initial coroner's inquest explaining a history of insanity and then finding the trial record where that disappears, you know, that would be a way of getting at that mystery. On your informational question about juries, you know, did they hear witnesses or were they largely self-informing? From what we can tell, and you know, it's hard to tell because the plea roll records of these cases are so thin. From what we can tell, they don't seem to have routinely heard witnesses in court. So I have a piece that I'm working on right now on fact finding in medieval English felony law, and you know, what I sort of building again off the work of Sarah Butler, I'm arguing that, you know, a lot of the fact finding that we expect to see happening in the trial phase is happening, but it's happening at the phase of the coroner's inquest in cases of homicide, or sometimes it's happening, the sheriff is going out and making inquiries, and where you get hints of that work happening, besides the fact that we have the coroner's records, is sometimes when you look at the records of jail delivery, you'll see the justices saying, you know what, we don't really have enough information to go on here. Let's send this person back into jail while the sheriff investigates further, or while the coroner, you know, or maybe the coroner hasn't shown up, and so we need to wait until we have more information. And we get a sense of who the coroner and the coroner's inquest is interviewing based on who is attached to appear and who's called to appear at that inquest. And of course, we don't get like the depositions that you get in the church courts. We instead get this tidy narrative that just like ties it all together, puts a bow on it. But we can surmise that there is that interview process happening, that interviewing of witnesses, and then it's getting boiled down into a single narrative.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I believe we have a question in the chat, so I will go ahead and read that out. Looking at the work of Claude Gavard, do you think that there are similarities between the culture of the King's Pardon between England and France?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And this is something which I would like to delve into further. So I'm thinking of the work of Helen Lacey and of Tom McSweeney, who's done some work on the sort of piety behind the king's use of the pardon power. And I think there is something similar at work in the French use of the pardon power and the English use, but I'll admit to being, much more familiar with the English side. But even there, it's not been something that I focused on deeply. I would say one big difference is the fact that I even found in my notes as I was speaking today, and I said, juries that are basically, I didn't say issuing pardons because that would have been completely false, but juries that are bringing about pardons and acquittals, but although the jury is not pardoning, you have the jury involved in that process of queuing up a narrative so that it can be sent to the king for the purpose of a pardon. When you look on the French side, you don't have that same use of the jury procedure for queuing up pardons. At least that's my vague understanding. I'm thinking of Sasha Fow's work too on pardon letters, but you might have families that are petitioning to the crown for a pardon. And so I think the mechanisms, the primary mechanisms through which pardons are being achieved might be a bit different. Again, I feel like I'm speaking in a realm, I don't know like the percentages of pardons in England that are achieved through the petition process versus, through a recommendation coming out of the trial process. So I hesitate to speak further. But maybe there's someone else on the call who can speak to that issue.
We have one additional question in the chat. What role does treason have here in relation to felony? Do we see treason differentiated from felony in the literary sources as well as in judicial opinion across the period?
Yeah, so this is another thing that could be a great project for someone who wants to take a deep dive. I mean, first I'll just say, I've worked on the etymology of felony and try to tease out what felony means, but even that, I feel like there's still more work to be done, especially I would love to, see someone who dives into the French sources and figures out a little bit more deeply how it's being used in that context. So the treason and felony connection, I think, is something that also merits a lot of further study. You do see in literary texts from the late 13th into the 14th century, often the pairing of treason and felony, they're used as if they're deeply intertwined. And I think that might have something to do with that old understanding of felony as a betrayal of one's lord. This idea of felony as the breaking of a feudal bond, which, is probably the closest we get to a notion that's something like treason, of that breaking of the bond, of what one owes to the king or to some other high authority. So I could say they're deeply bound together, but as felony develops as a concept of a category of law, it develops in a way that treason is kind of treated a bit separately from your run-of-the-mill felonies, your murders and thefts over a certain value and arson and so forth. Treason is treated as distinct, but I would assume kind of understood as a form of felony. So again, there's some ambiguity of exactly how those terms interplay, and I hope somebody will take a deeper dive on that subject and enlighten us all.
Well, I will ask one more myself, if you don't mind, while we wait for any final questions. I am curious about mental illness as a defense in the period. Were there any instances you found in which mental illness, and I'm sure this wouldn't necessarily be listed, but where it didn't function to exonerate the defendant, or which perhaps, episodes of mental illness were viewed as separate from the actual mens rea itself and not really connected?
Yeah, so I haven't found specific instances, but the fact that the records so often talk about the duration of the illness, and then the separate question of whether the person was in the throes of that illness at the time they committed an alleged crime, suggests to me that that was something they cared about, that it wasn't enough to say, you know, I've had this episodic illness for the last decade, but rather there had to be some demonstration that the person was at an acute state of illness at the time that they committed an offense. Where this may come up a little bit more. So I'm thinking about, you know, instances of trying to determine whether a suicide was felonious or not felonious. And I would imagine there the intersection of mental illness and the boundaries of felony may be a little bit trickier, especially because, you know, at that point, you're just dealing with the question of property forfeiture. You're no longer talking about the possibility of somebody losing their life. And so I think, you know, there may be a differential treatment in the area of suicide as compared with the area of felony accusation.
Sure.
But this is an area that I'm hoping to, you know, kind of investigate further. Use a couple of threads that I feel like I just started to pull on with my book. You know, one is the insanity defense, which I know, you know, much has been written on it, but I do feel like I want to take a deeper dive into close readings of these cases and trying to answer, you know, questions like what you've just posed, Doug, and what Cassie posed earlier, questions about whether mental illness is sometimes not enough to, or whether people claim it in a specious kind of way to, you know, that question of whether people are sometimes trying to rely on insanity, but doing so unsuccessfully. But that, and also another area where I dealt with it even less in the book is the, you know, intersection of intoxication and criminal culpability. That I think there is a story to be told, but it's a really difficult one to tease out from the records.
Sure. No, I know full well how difficult it can be off the plea rolls to try and to jump too far into this. Do we have any additional questions before we wrap up for the evening?
I might ask sorry.
Alec.
Yeah, I might ask a quick question if I could. I really enjoyed that. I really like this idea of sort of we're all felons, because it's quite an unusual idea. You don't really see sort of anything remotely similar in the present so much. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, sort of the roots of that idea and how it sort of changed the way they approached their roles as jurymen.
Yeah, so I mean, and that notion of we are all felons, and it's not always given in that language. I love the fact that I was able to find that language of putting it, you know, in the words of felony. That idea that we're all sinful, and also, you know, that someone could be, you know, a very upright and then could end up being, you know, Judas, you know, or somebody could be like Saul, who's oppressing Christians, and then could become the greatest champion. You know, there's that notion that people can change over time, you know, so combined with that sense of we're all sinners. I think it did lend itself to an understanding that you approach the act of judging with some humility of there, but for the grace of God go I, complicated by the fact that in some instances, you know, a homicide results because, you know, you get in an altercation outside a tavern at curfew, and, you know, the knives get pulled out and so forth, and somebody ends up, you know, with sepsis a few days later and dead, you know, and there could be a sense of that could have been me, you know. So my sense is that it does lend itself to approaching the act of judging with humility and erring on the side of an acquittal when, you know, the proof didn't seem to suffice to convince you that the conviction was appropriate. You know, on the notion of, you know, we're lacking of that in that understanding today, right? You know, look at our American system of criminal justice and our rates of incarceration. But there was actually a project out of the University of Minnesota School of Law, probably about 5 to 7 years ago at this point. And the project was called We Are All Criminals. I can't remember the name of the academic who put this together, but basically was making the point that any given one of us, you know, has at some point in our lives broken a criminal law, whether it was smoking marijuana when that was still illegal in certain places, or you know, the vehicular things, or setting a little fire when you were a teenager, whatever it might be. but the fact that it's only a certain number that gets swept up into the criminal legal system. But this project was so eye-opening because we don't tend to think about that. I think American society with regard to criminality until recently has been very puritanical, very judgmental, not a we are all felons, we are all sinners, we are all pilgrims, not inspired by that way of thinking. So, I don't tend to think I do medieval legal history to take lessons for the modern day, but every now and then, I wouldn't take a lesson like we should have the gallows for like every felony, but every now and then there is something worth thinking about. And I think this notion that we are all in some ways felons is maybe a good one to think with.
Well, fantastic. If we don't have any, oh, no, it looks like one just came in. Pardon me. On the treason and felony subject, coming from studying French public executions, often the individual who committed treason is called a felon, or in his person as a feel. So I think that there is a distinction between the individual being a felon and the crime itself, because I rarely see treason spoken of as felony. Just kind of a comment on that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, and that, my sense is that there's something similar going on the English side. I mean, treason is discussed as treason, but it is in a way part of the species of, one becomes a felon if you've committed treason. So that's super helpful.
Well, fantastic. Just one final call for questions. And if we don't have any, I just wanted to say thank you so very much, Professor Kamali. That was a fantastic seminar. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was a pleasure.
Very much a pleasure to have you. And this will be put up on our YouTube channel. Yep, applause. And this is our final seminar of Michaelmas term, and we will be back soon with our Lent term card, and we hope to see all of you then. So thank you so very much, and have happy holidays and a wonderful winter vacation, everybody.